Look at this graph. I made it. I'll fill it in by the end of the video. Ludo Lingo. Hello and welcome to Ludo Lingo episode 3. Originally, I was going to title this video, "What is a Soulslike?" And I was going to attempt to answer that question. But as I started actually writing things down in regards to that question, I started to realize that I didn't like how I was answering it, and I was kind of just giving myself more questions. At that point, I started questioning, is Soulslike a genre, or is it a feeling? Now I'm thinking, should we be saying this game is a Soulslike, or perhaps this game is Souls-like? I know that probably sounds like I just said the same thing twice, but to me, that kind of sums up my thoughts about this whole situation, because you have people mislabeling things all the time, misleading people into thinking a game plays a certain way when it really doesn't. Sometimes it's hard to tell based on just video footage. You really have to get your hands on a game to know if it really feels Souls-like. Action games or action RPGs tend to range somewhere from God of War, the original one, or something like Devil May Cry, all the way to the other end where you have Dark Souls. But how do we cover that? How do we get there? What's in the middle? Let's look into the first category, which I'm just deeming action, because that's what we tend to call these games. Character action game. You got your God of War, the original, Devil May Cry as a series, Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, and so on. And that's the baseline we're starting with here. I'm gonna pop up some other games that I consider action games and put them where I think they should be. As you see, the further up you go, the more Souls elements are included in the game. And the further to the right you go, the more the game actually feels like a Souls game when you're playing it. First of all, I don't know where to put Ghost of Tsushima. Honestly, it kind of doesn't go anywhere on this because it doesn't feel like a character action game, and it also doesn't feel like a Dark Souls game. So I'm just sticking it here, but realistically, it probably doesn't go anywhere on this chart. We got Darksiders 3, which people apparently have called a Souls-like. I don't really understand that. It's not. There's a couple other ones borrowed from Souls games, but realistically, it's mostly just an action game. Then we got a couple things that people don't really ever call Souls-like, but I've heard it slightly mentioned in terms of the new God of War games, and there is something there. The Monster Hunter series, at least from World and Rise, they do feel a little bit weighty. They feel a little bit more like you have to make commitments than in other action games, so I do think they move a little bit on this scale to the right, but they're definitely not Souls-like, that's for sure. Then you've got the two most recent God of War games, and it does have like parrying. You are a little more close up. The fighting is weighty. These are things that I like about it, and they definitely do feel a little bit more Souls-like than the original God of War, but they're still just action games. Now let's move on to the confusing part. I threw up a couple quotes here because these are kind of things you would hear generally to describe these games, and I think they're fairly accurate as long as you're not throwing the label a Souls-like onto these titles. You've got games like Wolong and Neo 2 that have a lot of elements that you would normally call a Souls-like, and people tend to do that with these games. But the thing is, I don't like these games because they don't feel like Souls-like. They're way too action-oriented, the combat is floaty, you're not really making hard commitments, they're a little too fast-paced. Otherwise, you've got like the checkpointing systems that is similar, you've got the currency dropping, but despite all of these things, it just doesn't feel right. So it's up here. Down at the bottom, you're gonna see Armored Core 6, which honestly, it probably should be in the green territory, but I kind of ran out of room. It's iffy. I wouldn't necessarily call this game Souls-like, but the thing is, because it's from software, you do feel that weight when you're playing it. And despite it really having nothing to do with all the different mechanics and stuff that are in Souls games, outside of deep in the combat where you're like dodging things and attacking with commitment and stuff, that's all it really has going for it in this department. So there are things that are technically Souls inspired here, but really it's just a hefty action game. To continue the confusion here, we've got games that people have definitely called Souls-like, such as Hollow Knight or the Blasphemous games, and to a lesser extent, Death's Door. I don't need to go over every individual mechanic in all of these games, but there's lots of things that are similar to Dark Souls. The thing is, there's a lot of things here that set them apart, and they're not trying to ape every single aspect, so these are kind of what I consider, along with something like Remnant 2, games that are firmly planted in the Souls-inspired category, or Souls-like, but not a Souls-like. Okay, you're getting me? You're not getting me. I don't even get me. It makes sense to me, okay? Also, recently we've had some controversy with Stellar Blade because people seem to call it a Souls-like when it is definitely not. There's things in it that are reminiscent of Souls, like you have the checkpointing system, you have big tough bosses, you unlock shortcuts that lead you back to your checkpoint so that you can make it to the boss easier. But the thing is, there's not a lot of punishment here. When you die, you just get sent back to where you were and you can easily get back. You don't have to worry about losing anything. Also, the combat is very fast and fluid. It's more in line with something like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, but it also has elements of Sekiro, which leads me to my next point. Sekiro is not a Souls-like. It lies just outside of that. It's kind of its own thing. Honestly, you could bring up something like Lies of P, or like I was just talking about Stellar Blade. They're almost like Sekiro-likes in a way. Definitely Stellar Blade. No, I'm not trying to coin that term. We're not going to start doing that. Please don't quote me. Sekiro is obviously borrowing a lot of aspects from Dark Souls, but the lack of you being able to customize your character and really make a class totally sets this apart from me. The absence of that, the absence of the stat building and stuff like that, kind of disqualifies it in a way. It's more of a pure action game. It's really the center of all of this nonsense. Like everything revolves around Sekiro. It's like what side of Sekiro are you? If you're on one side of it, you're a Souls-like. If you're on the other side, you're not. All right. And now just on the other side, we get to the games that I do believe are Souls-likes. In the 2D realm, you've got Salt and Sanctuary and also Salt and Sacrifice. They're pretty much copying almost every single mechanic from Dark Souls. But of course, it is in 2D and it's a little bit different. It doesn't feel quite right because it's not exactly easy to translate the 3D feeling into 2D. Recently, I've been playing Another Crab's Treasure, and they copy a lot of things from Dark Souls. And no, I don't use copy as a negative. That's great. But it's also got its own personality. It feels like a SpongeBob game mixed with Banjo-Kazooie. You got 3D platforming, you got silly characters, you got lots of color. A lot of things to set it apart, but also at its core, it is a Souls-like. That is like the entire point of the game, is that it is like Dark Souls. A little bit further in the direction, probably the best game on here in terms of what it's doing in the Souls-like genre, if we're gonna make it a genre, is Lies of P. I don't think I have a single negative thing to say about this game. It differentiates itself just enough. It's a little bit in the Sekiro direction, but it's definitely still firmly in the Dark Souls-like spot. It's a little bit faster paced, which is why I have it beside Bloodborne, because Bloodborne and Lies of P are very similar. Lies of P is just slightly more like Sekiro. I know this chart is somewhat nonsense. I tried to put things where I thought they belonged. It's not perfect. Deal with it. And then we've got a couple games that I feel like truly are just trying to copy Dark Souls, and that's totally fine. The Surge and The Surge 2, the second one's definitely better, but pretty much every aspect from Dark Souls is in here. They got a little bit of extra flair because you're cutting off machines' parts and then you're like customizing your body. It's a cool little gimmick. They're not particularly amazing games, but I did have a good time, especially with the second one. Similarly, you got Lords of the Fallen, which you've got the original in 2014 and then the rebooted version, or whatever they wanted to call it, that happened last year. I really liked the 2023 version. It's very similar to Dark Souls 3 in particular. But again, they've got their own unique little spin on it, with there being this like duality of worlds. But realistically, you could probably show somebody this game and trick them into thinking it was a Dark Souls game. That is how similar it is. And they pulled off the feeling very well. Then we end up in the corner with Dark Souls, which you can imagine behind that you've got Dark Souls 2, Demon Souls, Dark Souls 3, and Elden Ring. They all go firmly up in that corner. Maybe pull down Dark Souls 2 just a tiny bit to the left because it doesn't quite feel right, but we're not going to talk about that right now. And there you have it. Did I solve the world's problems? Do we know what a Souls-like is now? Do we know what Souls-like versus a Souls-like means? Probably not. Are we just going to keep calling everything Souls-like anyways? Yes, but hopefully I've given you a little bit of nuance for your opinion. Maybe you can spread the word. Show people this chart and try to get them to make sense of it. It won't make sense, but you will appear as though you have some sort of knowledge on the subject, even if they're like, why did you do this? And then you can tell them it was me that did this, not you. You are not to be blamed. It was me being insane making this. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully there's a game here that you weren't aware of that I've now made clear to you is something, somehow, some way similar to Dark Souls, and maybe you're gonna go try one of these games. I don't know. I appreciate you watching. Feel free to check me out on Twitch. Feel free to check me out on Backlogged. Thank you to those supporting me on Patreon, such as Kinoth and Scion and Mex and Hookie. And I will see you next week with something.